Money can buy many things, but it cannot buy away the truth that lives in a child's eyes. When billionaire Marcus Whitfield first looked into those innocent brown eyes, he saw something that would shatter his carefully constructed world of denial. What started as a simple refusal to acknowledge his housemaid's pregnancy would become a journey that forced him to confront not just his responsibilities, but his humanity itself. This is the story of a man who thought he could deny his own blood, a woman who refused to give up hope, and a baby whose mere existence would prove that some truths are too powerful to hide. Sometimes it takes the smallest person in the room to teach the most powerful man the biggest lesson of his life. Marcus Whitfield stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a kingdom he ruled from his ivory tower. At 42, he had built an empire worth billions, turning a small tech startup into a global corporation that touched every corner of modern life. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had everything: designer suits, perfectly styled hair, and the kind of confidence that came from never hearing the word no. The conversation from 3 hours ago still echoed in his mind. Maria Santos, his housemaid for the past 2 years, had stood in this very room with tears in her eyes, her hands trembling as she spoke words that Marcus refused to accept. "Mr. Whitfield, I need to tell you something important," she had said, her accent thick with emotion. "I am pregnant. The baby is yours." Marcus had barely looked up from his tablet, where stock prices danced across the screen in green and red. "That's impossible, Maria. I suggest you think very carefully about what you're saying. Sir, please listen to me. That night, 3 months ago, when your wife was in Paris for her sister's wedding, you came home late from the office party. You had been drinking and you asked me to help you to your room. Stop." Marcus had finally looked at her, his grey eyes cold as winter steel. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but I won't be a part of it. If you're pregnant, it has nothing to do with me." Maria's face had crumpled, but she pressed on. "Mr. Whitfield, I have never been with any other man. I am telling you the truth. This baby needs his father." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Marcus had turned back to his tablet, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. "We'll discuss your employment termination tomorrow. I suggest you use tonight to pack your things. Now." 3 hours later, Marcus poured himself a glass of 25-year-old scotch and tried to push the conversation from his mind. His wife, Catherine, was in the Hamptons for the weekend with her book club friends, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his denial. Maria Santos was a simple woman from El Salvador who sent most of her earnings back to her family. She lived in the small servants' quarters on the building's service floor, invisible to the wealthy residents who never bothered to learn her name. Marcus had noticed her efficiency, her quiet grace, the way she moved through the penthouse like a ghost who left everything spotless in her wake. That night 3 months ago was a blur of champagne and corporate victories. His company had just closed the biggest deal in its history, and the celebration had gone late into the night. Catherine had been away. The penthouse felt empty. And Maria had been there when he stumbled through the front door, her brown eyes wide with concern as she helped steady him. The details were fuzzy, lost in a haze of alcohol and ego, but Marcus remembered the warmth of her presence, the way she had looked at him not as the untouchable billionaire, but as a man who needed help. What happened next was something he had buried deep in his mind, wrapped in layers of justification and selective memory. But Maria remembered everything. She remembered how he had looked at her that night, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. She remembered his hands on her face, gentle despite their size, and the way he had whispered her name like a prayer. She remembered thinking that maybe, just maybe, beneath all that wealth and power, was a lonely man who needed someone to see his heart. She had been wrong about everything except the loneliness. The next morning, Marcus had avoided her completely, leaving early for the office and returning late when she would already be gone. When they did cross paths, he looked through her as if she were made of air. The man who had held her so tenderly vanished, replaced by the cold businessman who saw her as nothing more than hired help. Now, as Marcus drained his scotch glass, he felt a knot forming in his stomach that had nothing to do with the alcohol. Maria's words played on repeat in his mind. This baby needs his father. He walked to his home office, a shrine to his success filled with awards, photographs with world leaders, and the kind of art that cost more than most people made in a lifetime. On his desk sat a framed photo of him and Catherine on their wedding day 5 years ago. She looked radiant in her designer gown, her blonde hair perfect, her smile the kind that graced magazine covers. They were the perfect power couple, featured in society pages and business magazines as an example of modern success. What they were not was happy. Catherine had made it clear early in their marriage that children were not in her plans. Her figure, her freedom, her social commitments, a baby would complicate everything she had worked to build. Marcus had agreed, or thought he had. The truth was he had never really considered what he wanted beyond the next business deal, the next acquisition, the next victory that would prove his worth to the world. Now, somewhere in the building below him, a woman carrying what might be his child was packing her few belongings, preparing to disappear from his life forever. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it felt like something vital was slipping through his fingers. Marcus opened his laptop and pulled up Maria's employment file. The photograph showed a woman with kind eyes and a shy smile, her dark hair pulled back neatly, her uniform crisp and professional. The file listed her age as 28, her emergency contact as her sister in Maryland, and her previous employment at a hotel in downtown Washington before moving to New York. There was so little information about the woman who had shared his bed for one night and now claimed to carry his child. She was a stranger whose presence he had taken for granted, whose life beyond these walls was a mystery he had never bothered to explore. His phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. Staying an extra day in the Hamptons. Don't wait up tomorrow night either. Love you. Love you. The words felt hollow, automatic, like the closing line of a business email. When was the last time either of them had meant those words? When was the last time they had really looked at each other, talked about anything deeper than social calendars and investment portfolios? Marcus poured another scotch and walked back to the windows. The city lights blurred together, creating patterns that reminded him of stars he used to watch as a child in Ohio, before money and ambition had transported him to this glass tower above the world. Somewhere down there, Maria was preparing to raise his child alone. She would probably go back to El Salvador, where a dollar stretched further and family could help with the baby. His child would grow up speaking Spanish before English, playing in dusty streets instead of Central Park, never knowing that his father lived in a penthouse with more bedrooms than a small hotel. The thought should have felt foreign, abstract, like considering a plot from a movie that had nothing to do with his life. Instead, it felt like a weight settling onto his chest, making it hard to breathe. Marcus had always prided himself on being rational, logical, driven by facts rather than emotions. But the fact that Maria had never lied to him in 2 years of employment was harder to ignore than he wanted to admit. The fact that she had asked for nothing, no money, no promises, just acknowledgement, spoke to a sincerity that his cynical mind struggled to dismiss. And then there was the other fact, the one that cut deepest of all. That night, 3 months ago, in his loneliness and vulnerability, he had reached for comfort in the arms of a woman who worked for him. A woman whose trust he had betrayed and whose life he was now trying to erase, with the same casual cruelty he used to eliminate business competitors. The scotch burned as it went down, but not as much as the growing realization that Maria Santos might be the most honest person in his life, and he was about to lose her forever. Over a truth he was too proud to face. Outside his windows, the city pulsed with the dreams and struggles of millions of people he would never meet. People whose lives were shaped by the decisions of men like him, who lived in towers and thought themselves above the consequences of their actions. But consequences, Marcus was beginning to understand, had a way of finding you no matter how high you climbed. In his pocket, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was not Catherine, but the building's security desk. Mr. Whitfield, this is Rodriguez downstairs. Ms. Santos asked me to give you a message. She said to tell you that she will be gone by morning, and that she hopes someday you will meet your child and be proud of who they become. Marcus ended the call without responding, but the message echoed in his mind long into the night. Pride. It was something he thought he understood, something he measured in dollars and deals, and the fear he saw in his competitors' eyes. But as he stood alone in his penthouse, surrounded by all the symbols of his success, Marcus Whitfield began to wonder if he had ever felt true pride in his life, or if everything he had built was just an elaborate monument to his own emptiness. The baby was coming, whether he acknowledged it or not. Maria Santos was leaving, whether he stopped her or not. And somewhere in the space between those two certainties, a man who thought he could control everything was about to learn that the most important things in life could not be bought, sold, or denied into non-existence. They could only be faced, accepted, and lived with honor, or lost forever to the cold satisfaction of being right about things that did not matter at all. 6 months later, Marcus Whitfield sat in his office on the 42nd floor of the Whitfield Tower, staring at a photograph that had arrived in his morning mail with no return address. It showed a woman pushing a stroller through a park, her face partially hidden by the shadow of trees, but her posture unmistakably familiar. Maria Santos had not disappeared as completely as he had hoped. The photograph had been taken in Baltimore, based on the distinctive architecture visible in the background. Marcus recognized the Washington Monument, rising in the distance. She had not gone back to El Salvador after all, but had settled somewhere close enough to remind him that some problems did not solve themselves through willful ignorance. He had hired the best lawyers money could buy to ensure that Maria could never come back to haunt him. They had documented her termination for personal misconduct, created a paper trail that would make any future claims against him appear opportunistic, and ensured that she would never work in Manhattan's domestic service industry again. It was a thorough, efficient character assassination performed by men in expensive suits who asked no questions and left no loose ends, except for the child. The child who, according to the private investigator Marcus had finally hired, was a boy named Diego Santos, born healthy and strong in a community hospital in Baltimore. The boy who had his father's grey eyes and his mother's stubborn spirit, according to the report that now lay open on Marcus's mahogany desk, like evidence of a crime he was still pretending he had not committed. Marcus picked up the investigator's report and read it again, though he had memorized every word since receiving it 3 days ago. Maria was working 3 jobs to support herself and the baby, cleaning offices at night, working at a laundromat during the day, and taking in sewing on weekends. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that the report diplomatically described as economically challenged, sharing the space with her sister Rosa and Rosa's 2 children. The investigator had included photographs of Maria's daily routine, and Marcus found himself studying them with an intensity that surprised him. There she was, emerging from the laundromat with tired eyes but straight shoulders, her son strapped to her chest in a carrier that looked hand-sewn. There she was at a playground, pushing Diego on a swing while Rosa's children played nearby, her smile genuine despite the exhaustion written in the lines around her eyes. And there was Diego himself, 8 months old now, with dark hair and skin that spoke of his heritage, but eyes that belonged unmistakably to his father. Even in the grainy surveillance photos, those eyes seemed to look directly into the camera, directly into Marcus's soul, asking questions that he was not ready to answer. Catherine had noticed his distraction, though she attributed it to work stress rather than the existence of a son she knew nothing about. Their marriage had settled into a comfortable routine of mutual indifference, punctuated by social events where they played the role of the perfect couple for audiences who cared more about their stock portfolio than their happiness. "You've been different lately," Catherine said one evening over dinner at their favorite restaurant, a place where reservations were impossible to get and the wine cost more per bottle than Maria made in a month. "Distant. More distant than usual, I mean." Marcus looked up from his untouched salmon, realizing he had been thinking about the photograph of Diego laughing as Maria tickled his feet in their tiny apartment. "Just business. The quarterly reports are keeping me up at night." Catherine nodded, accepting the lie because it was easier than pushing for the truth. Their conversation moved on to safer topics: their upcoming trip to the Swiss Alps, the charity gala Catherine was planning, the new art installation they were commissioning for the penthouse, surface things, beautiful things, things that filled the space between them without touching the emptiness at its center. But that night, alone in his study while Catherine slept, Marcus found himself researching Diego's neighborhood online. Street view images showed a community where children played in small parks surrounded by buildings that had seen better decades, where corner stores advertised check cashing and money transfers to Central America, where life happened at a volume and intensity that his penthouse existence had insulated him from completely. He found himself wondering what Diego's first word had been, whether he had his mother's musical laugh, if he was walking yet or still crawling across the worn carpet of their 1-bedroom apartment. These were questions that felt foreign to his analytical mind, emotions that he had spent decades training himself not to feel. The investigator, a discreet man named Peterson who specialized in what he called sensitive family matters, had been thorough in his research. Maria's sister Rosa worked as a nurse at Johns Hopkins, was divorced with 2 daughters ages 7 and 9, and served as Diego's primary caregiver while Maria worked her multiple jobs. The family attended St. Joseph Catholic Church every Sunday, where Diego was baptized in a ceremony that Marcus's money could have made elaborate, but his absence made simple. Peterson's report also included financial information that made Marcus uncomfortable in ways he had not expected. Maria's combined income from her 3 jobs barely covered rent, utilities, and food for 4 people. She had no health insurance, relying on community clinics for Diego's care. Her sister's nursing salary helped, but medical expenses from Rosa's own health problems Diabetes that required expensive medication stretched their budget to breaking point monthly. The report noted that Maria had never applied for government assistance despite clearly qualifying, had never sought legal advice despite having grounds for a paternity claim that could secure Diego's future, and had never attempted to contact Marcus despite knowing exactly where to find him. Her pride, it seemed, was as uncompromising as his own, though far more honorable in its application. Marcus found this information more disturbing than any corporate espionage report he had ever received. Maria Santos was struggling to raise his son while he spent more on wine in a month than she made all year, and she had asked for nothing. The contrast painted a picture of his character that made him deeply uncomfortable, with the man looking back at him from his office windows. He began following Diego's development through Peterson's monthly reports like a distant relative keeping track of a family he could never acknowledge. Diego's first steps taken in the living room of their apartment while Maria cheered and Rosa clapped. His first word, which was "mama," spoken with perfect clarity during the Sunday dinner at their kitchen table that seated 4 people in the space of Marcus's walk-in closet. The boy was developing normally, thriving even, despite circumstances that Marcus's privileged mind had assumed would be devastating. Diego was surrounded by love, laughter, and the kind of attention that money could not buy. His extended family, Rosa's daughters, treated him like their baby brother, created a support system that Marcus's own childhood, spent largely with nannies while his parents built their own smaller empire, had never included. This realization created an uncomfortable parallel that Marcus tried to ignore. His own father had been a brilliant businessman who measured success in acquisitions and market share, who had provided every material comfort while remaining emotionally unavailable. Marcus had grown up in penthouses and boarding schools, surrounded by luxury but starved for the kind of genuine affection he could see in every photograph of Maria with Diego. Was he now repeating the same pattern, but worse? His father had at least been present, even if distant. Marcus was choosing complete absence, denying his son even the acknowledgement of his existence. The thought began, keeping him awake at night. He would lie in his designer bed, listening to Catherine's peaceful breathing beside him, and wonder what Diego looked like when he slept. Did he fight sleep like Marcus had as a child, or did he surrender to it peacefully in his mother's arms? Did Maria sing him lullabies in Spanish, sharing the heritage that Marcus could never give him? Peterson's reports became more detailed as Marcus requested additional information. He wanted to know what books Maria read to Diego, what toys he preferred, whether he showed signs of the intelligence that ran in the Whitfield family. The investigator provided answers to all these questions with professional discretion, never asking why a man would want such intimate details about a child he refused to acknowledge. Diego loved books, especially ones with animals. He was fascinated by music, clapping along whenever Maria played Spanish songs on her old radio. He was curious about everything, reaching for objects with the determined focus that Marcus recognized from his own childhood. The boy was clearly intelligent, observant, already showing signs of the analytical mind that had made Marcus successful in business. But Diego also showed qualities that Marcus had never possessed: an easy contentment, a joy in simple pleasures, a trust in the world around him that spoke of security despite material limitations. These were gifts from his mother, from the family that surrounded him with love rather than expectations, from a community that celebrated small victories rather than demanding constant achievement. Marcus began to understand that in denying Diego, he was not protecting him from poverty or difficulty. Maria and Rosa were doing that with far more success than Marcus had imagined possible. Instead, he was depriving his son of opportunities that only a father could provide, and depriving himself of experiences that no amount of money could purchase. The realization grew slowly, like morning light creeping across a landscape that had been hidden in darkness. Marcus had built his life around the belief that acknowledgement meant obligation, that recognition meant vulnerability, that admitting paternity would somehow diminish his power or status. But watching Diego's development from afar, seeing the boy's potential and Maria's dedication, he began to wonder if his real fear was not responsibility, but irrelevance. What if he reached out to them and discovered that his money could not buy what they already had? What if his presence added nothing to their lives, or worse, disrupted the happiness they had built without him? What if Diego looked at him with those familiar grey eyes and saw not a father but a stranger who had abandoned them when they needed him most? The question circled through Marcus's mind, like birds looking for a place to land, finding no comfortable answers in the carefully constructed world he had built around his own importance. But as Diego's first birthday approached, as Peterson's reports showed a healthy, happy boy taking his first steps and speaking his first words, Marcus began to realize that his fears might be less important than his son's right to know where he came from. The boy in the photographs had his eyes, his stubborn chin, and his mother's beautiful spirit. Diego Santos existed whether Marcus acknowledged him or not, was growing and learning, and becoming his own person regardless of his father's denial. The only question remaining was whether Marcus would find the courage to step out of his tower and into a reality where love mattered more than control, where being right meant far less than being present. The answer to that question would determine not just Diego's future, but whether Marcus Whitfield would remain a successful businessman who happened to have fathered a child, or become something far more challenging and rewarding, a father who happened to be successful at business. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, until Marcus found himself standing in the lobby of Johns Hopkins Hospital, watching Maria Santos walk through automatic doors with Diego strapped to her chest in that same handmade carrier. He had not planned to be there. Peterson's report had mentioned that Diego had a routine pediatric appointment, and Marcus had found himself checking his calendar, noting that he had a breakfast meeting in Baltimore with potential investors. The meeting was real, but his decision to arrive 2 hours early and drive past the hospital was entirely his own choice, though he would not admit it even to himself. Marcus had told his driver to wait in the parking garage while he walked through the hospital's main entrance, telling himself he was simply getting coffee before his meeting. But the moment he saw Maria emerge from the elevator, her movements careful and protective as she carried their son, all his rationalizations crumbled. She looked tired, more tired than in Peterson's photographs. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore jeans that had seen better years, with a sweater that had been mended at the elbow. But her posture was still proud, still graceful, and when she looked down at Diego and whispered something in Spanish that made him giggle, Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest. Diego was bigger than he had expected, more real than any photograph could capture. His dark hair caught the morning light streaming through the hospital's glass walls, and when he turned his head to look around the busy lobby, Marcus saw his own eyes looking out with curiosity and intelligence. Maria was almost to the main entrance when Diego spotted Marcus across the lobby. The boy's gaze locked onto his father's face with the directness that only children possessed, and for a moment that felt like eternity. Father and son simply looked at each other across a space filled with strangers hurrying to their own urgent destinations. Diego smiled. It was not the polite smile of recognition, but the open, joyful expression of a child delighted by something new and interesting. He pointed at Marcus with one small finger and said something in his baby language that sounded like a question. Maria followed her son's gaze and went completely still. The color drained from her face as she saw Marcus standing there in his expensive suit, looking every inch the powerful businessman who had dismissed her from his life 14 months ago. For a moment, Marcus thought she might run, might clutch Diego closer, and disappear through the automatic doors before he could find the words to explain what he was doing there. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and walked directly toward him. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, when she was close enough that other people could not overhear. Her voice was steady, controlled, but he could see the questions and hurt in her dark eyes. "What are you doing here?" Marcus realized he had no answer that would make sense to anyone, least of all to himself. "I was in Baltimore for business," he said, the words sounding hollow even as he spoke them. "I saw you walking through the lobby." Maria studied his face with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to trust easy explanations. "This is a big hospital, Mr. Whitfield. Baltimore is a big city. You just happened to be here at exactly the time I brought Diego for his checkup?" Diego babbled something and reached toward Marcus, his small hands opening and closing in the universal gesture of a child who wanted to touch something that fascinated him. Marcus found himself taking a step closer before stopping, unsure of protocol or permission or anything beyond the magnetic pull of his son's attention. "May I?" Marcus asked, gesturing toward Diego, then immediately feeling foolish for asking permission to acknowledge his own child. Maria's expression softened slightly, though wariness remained in her eyes. "He is friendly with strangers," she said carefully. "But he is also very smart. Children sense things that adults try to hide." Marcus moved closer, and Diego immediately reached for his tie, grasping the silk fabric with tiny fingers that were stronger than Marcus had expected. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable. Diego had Marcus's eyes, his strong chin, even the way his eyebrows drew together when he concentrated on something new. "Hello," Marcus said softly, and Diego responded with a stream of happy babbling that needed no translation. "He is saying hello back," Maria said, watching the interaction with an expression Marcus could not read. "He has many words now. Mama, abuela, agua, pelota, and papa," though he uses it for any man who pays attention to him, because he has never had a father to learn the difference. The words landed like physical blows, each one precisely aimed to remind Marcus of everything he had chosen not to be. But there was no cruelty in Maria's voice, only a statement of fact that hurt more than any accusation could have. "He looks healthy," Marcus said, because commenting on Diego's obvious intelligence or beauty felt too much like claiming credit for qualities he had not earned the right to acknowledge. "He is very healthy," Maria confirmed. "Strong like his father, but gentle like his mama. I hope. The doctor says he is perfect, which I already knew, but liked to hear anyway." Diego had transferred his attention from Marcus's tie to his watch, a piece of Swiss engineering that cost more than Maria made in 6 months. The boy studied the moving parts with fascination, turning the watch face to catch the light. "He likes shiny things," Maria explained, then caught herself as if she had revealed too much about their daily life. "What else does he like?" Marcus asked, and was surprised by how genuinely he wanted to know. Maria hesitated, then seemed to decide that answering would do no harm. "Books, music. He loves when Rosa's daughters sing to him. He laughs at everything, the cat next door, the bus going past our window, his own reflection in mirrors. He is a very happy baby, even when things are hard." Even when things are hard. The phrase hung between them, acknowledging without accusation the financial struggles that Marcus knew about through Peterson's reports, but had never seen up close. "Maria," Marcus began, then stopped because he had no idea how to continue. What did he want to say? That he was sorry for denying Diego? That he wanted to help financially? That seeing his son in person had awakened something he had been fighting for over a year? "Why are you really here?" Maria asked gently. "Not the business meeting. The real reason." Marcus looked into her eyes and saw the same honesty that had made him trust her in his household, the same directness that had made her confession about Diego's parentage impossible to dismiss completely, despite his efforts. "I don't know," he admitted. "I think about him sometimes, about you. About what kind of man refuses to acknowledge his own son." "And what kind of man is that?" Maria asked. "A coward," Marcus said, the word coming out before he could stop it. "A man who built his whole life around being in control and can't handle anything that doesn't fit into his plans." Diego chose that moment to look up at Marcus with those familiar grey eyes and smile again, an expression so pure and uncomplicated that Marcus felt his carefully constructed defenses crumble entirely. "He is beautiful," Marcus whispered, finally allowing himself to say what had been obvious from the first photograph. "Yes," Maria agreed simply. "He is." They stood in silence for a moment. 3 people connected by biology and choice, and the weight of decisions that could not be undone. Around them, the hospital hummed with activity, but Marcus felt as if they were standing in a bubble of quiet where only truth could exist. "I hired an investigator," Marcus said finally. "I know about your jobs, your apartment, Rosa's medical bills. I know you've never asked for anything, never tried to contact me, never even put my name on Diego's birth certificate." Maria's face tightened. "You had someone watching us?" "I needed to know if you were telling the truth about his paternity, and I wanted to make sure he was all right." "The truth?" Maria's voice rose slightly. Then she consciously lowered it as other people in the lobby glanced their way. "You wanted to make sure I was not lying about your son. But you did not want to find out by talking to me directly. You sent a stranger to spy on us instead of picking up the telephone." Marcus felt heat rise in his face. Put that way, his actions sounded even more cowardly than they had felt at the time. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Of what?" "Of this," Marcus said, gesturing between them. "Of finding out that you were telling the truth. Of discovering that I had a son and didn't know how to be his father." Maria studied his face for a long moment, then shifted Diego to her other hip as he began to fuss slightly. "Fear is not an excuse for abandonment, Mr. Whitfield. Many men are afraid to be fathers. Most of them try anyway." "Most of them didn't grow up the way I did," Marcus said, then immediately regretted the self-pity in his voice. "How did you grow up?" Maria asked, genuine curiosity replacing some of the anger in her expression. "With everything money could buy and nothing it couldn't. My father was brilliant at business and terrible at being present. My mother cared more about social status than emotional connection. I learned to measure success by profit margins and stock prices, and I have no idea how to measure what matters to a child." Diego had begun to squirm in Maria's arms, making the soft fussing sounds that meant he was getting hungry or tired, or both. Maria shifted him again, her movements practiced and efficient. "I should go," she said. "He needs to eat, and I have to be at work by 2. "Where do you work?" Marcus asked, though he already knew from Peterson's reports. "3 places," Maria said without elaborating. "It keeps us busy." Marcus pulled out his wallet, then stopped as he saw Maria's expression freeze. "I wasn't going to," he said quickly. "I know you wouldn't take it." "Then why did you reach for it?"
"Because I don't know how else to help."
"Money is the only way I've ever solved problems." "Diego is not a problem to be solved," Maria said firmly. "He is a child who deserves a father, not a benefactor." The words hit harder than any business rejection Marcus had ever received. In trying to protect himself from the complications of fatherhood, he had reduced his son to a problem that money could address, rather than a person who needed love. "I don't know how to be a father," Marcus said quietly. "Neither did any man who ever became one," Maria replied. "They learned by doing it, by making mistakes, by loving their children more than their fears." Diego had settled against Maria's shoulder and was beginning to fall asleep, his small fist curled against her sweater. Watching them together, Marcus felt a longing so acute it was almost physical pain. "Can I see him again?" he asked. Maria was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she might refuse. Finally, she said, "That depends." "On what?" "On whether you want to see Diego because you are curious about him or because you are ready to be his father. Because he deserves better than a man who appears and disappears whenever it is convenient. He deserves consistency, commitment, love without conditions." Marcus looked down at his sleeping son and tried to imagine what kind of father he could become. Not like his own father, certainly. But what would he be like? Could he learn to put Diego's needs before his own comfort? Could he love unconditionally, without the performance metrics that governed every other aspect of his life? "I don't know if I can be what he needs," Marcus admitted. "Then you are not ready," Maria said gently. "But if you ever decide that you want to try, that you are willing to put Diego first, even when it is difficult or inconvenient or expensive in ways that have nothing to do with money, then we can talk again." She adjusted the baby carrier and prepared to leave, then turned back to Marcus one last time. "He is going to grow up asking questions about his father," she said. "Someday I will have to decide whether to tell him that his papa was too afraid to love him, or too busy to find him, or just did not want him. I would prefer to tell him something better than that. But the choice is yours, Mr. Parse. Whitfield. It has always been yours." Maria walked away, carrying Diego toward the automatic doors and the life they had built without Marcus. He stood in the hospital lobby long after they disappeared, replaying every word of their conversation and trying to understand why seeing his son in person had changed everything he thought he knew about himself. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Whitfield faced a choice that could not be analyzed through spreadsheets or market research. He could continue living as if Diego did not exist, protecting himself from the vulnerability of fatherhood. Or he could step into the unknown territory of loving someone more than himself, risking everything he had built for the chance to build something infinitely more valuable. The decision, as Maria had said, was entirely his. But as he walked back to his car and the business meeting that suddenly seemed completely unimportant, Marcus realized that some choices could not be postponed indefinitely. Diego would not wait forever for a father to find his courage, and Maria would not hold space for a man who could not decide whether his own child was worth the risk of becoming human. The phone call came at 3 a.m, cutting through Marcus's fitful sleep like an alarm he had been dreading for months. Rosa's voice was strained, speaking quickly in accented English that became thicker with emotion. "Bah, Mr. Whitfield? This is Rosa Santos, Maria's sister. I got your number from the business card you left at the hospital. There has been an accident." Marcus was instantly awake, his heart pounding as he reached for the bedside lamp. "What kind of accident? Is Diego all right?" "The baby is fine, but Maria was hurt. A car hit her when she was crossing the street after her night shift. She is unconscious, and the doctors don't know when she will wake up. Diego has been crying for hours. He needs his mama, but she cannot come to him." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Maria unconscious. Diego crying. His son needing comfort that his absent father could not provide. "Which hospital?" Marcus asked, already getting out of bed. "Johns Hopkins, the same place where you met us." "Mr. Whitfield, I know this is not your responsibility, but I am working double shifts this week because my supervisor is sick and my daughters need me here. I cannot take care of Diego the way he needs right now, and he keeps asking for people who are not here." Marcus understood. Diego was calling for his father, using the word Papa that he applied to any man who might fill the void that Marcus had created through his absence. "I'll be there in 2 hours," Marcus said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Are you sure? I know this is complicated for you." "Diego is my son," Marcus said, the words feeling strange and right in his mouth. "Of course I'm sure." He dressed quickly in jeans and a sweater, clothing more casual than he had worn outside his penthouse in years. Catherine was in London for a gallery opening, so there were no questions to answer, no explanations to give. Marcus left a note for his housekeeper and drove toward Baltimore through empty highways, his mind racing faster than his car. Maria was hurt. The woman who had worked 3 jobs to support their son, who had never asked for anything despite having every right to demand everything, was lying unconscious in a hospital room while their child cried for parents who had failed him in different but equally profound ways. Marcus had spent 2 months since their encounter at the hospital thinking about Maria's challenge to become a real father rather than a guilty observer. He had researched child development, parenting books, even consulted with a therapist about overcoming the emotional distance his own upbringing had created. But all the research in the world had not prepared him for the reality of driving toward his son's crisis at 3 in the morning, knowing that he might be the only person who could help. The hospital parking garage was nearly empty, and Marcus found himself walking the same route he had taken months earlier when he had accidentally encountered Maria and Diego. But this time there was no pretense, no plausible excuse for his presence. He was there because his family needed him, and the simplicity of that truth was both terrifying and liberating. Rosa met him in the pediatric wing's waiting room, holding a crying Diego who struggled against her arms, his small fists beating against her shoulder in frustration. The moment Diego saw Marcus, he reached toward him with desperate intensity, his cries taking on a different quality that sounded unmistakably like Papa. "He has been like this for an hour," Rosa said, exhaustion clear in her voice. "Nothing I do comforts him. I think he remembers you from before." Marcus took Diego carefully, unsure of his technique but guided by instinct and the child's obvious need. Diego immediately quieted, his small body relaxing against Marcus's chest, as if he had been waiting for exactly this comfort. The feeling was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Diego's weight in his arms, his warmth, the way he settled into the curve of Marcus's shoulder as if he belonged there, it was recognition at a cellular level, biology overriding months of denial and fear.
"He knows you," Rosa said softly, wonder in her voice.
"He has been asking for Papa for hours, but he quieted the moment you held him." Marcus looked down at his son, whose grey eyes were still wet with tears but no longer panicked. Diego's small hand had found the collar of Marcus's sweater and was gripping it with determination, as if afraid his father might disappear again. "How is Maria?" Marcus asked, settling into a chair with Diego still clinging to him. "She has a head injury and some broken ribs. The doctors say her condition is stable, but they cannot tell us when she will wake up. It could be days, or longer." Rosa's voice wavered. "She is the strongest person I know, but seeing her so still, so quiet. Diego keeps asking where Mama is, and I do not know what to tell him." Marcus felt a rage building in his chest that had nothing to do with business competitors or market setbacks. Someone had hurt the mother of his child, had endangered the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise Diego alone while Marcus lived in denial. The protective instinct was primal, overwhelming, and completely foreign to his previous experience. "Tell me what happened," he said, keeping his voice gentle for Diego's sake. "She was walking home from her cleaning job downtown. It was late, after midnight, but she always takes that route, because it is safer than the bus stop near our apartment. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit her in the crosswalk. She managed to push her purse away before the impact, so the police knew to call me." Marcus closed his eyes, imagining Maria alone on a dark street at midnight, walking home from a job that barely paid enough to cover Diego's basic needs while his father slept in luxury 40 miles away. The injustice of it made him physically sick. "The driver?" Marcus asked. "Rich college kid from the suburbs. His father already has lawyers involved. They are saying Maria was not in the crosswalk properly, that she was partially responsible." Rosa's anger was controlled but unmistakable. She has no insurance to pay for lawyers to fight them. The familiar territory of legal battles was something Marcus understood completely. But this time, he would not be fighting for profit margins or market share. This time, he would be fighting for his family. "She will have lawyers," Marcus said quietly, "the best ones available." Rosa studied his face. "Why?" Yesterday you were a stranger who had investigated my sister like a criminal. Today you are holding your son and offering to fight legal battles. What changed? Marcus looked down at Diego, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder, with the complete trust that only children could give. Everything, he said simply. Diego slept in Marcus's arms for 3 hours while Rosa dozed in the adjacent chair. Marcus did not sleep at all. He used the time to study his son's face, memorizing features he should have known by heart, making silent promises about the kind of father he would become once he figured out how. Diego's eyelashes were impossibly long, casting shadows on his cheeks. His hair was thick and dark, already showing signs of the stubborn cowlick that Marcus remembered fighting as a child. His breathing was deep and peaceful, the sleep of someone who felt completely safe. When Diego finally woke, he looked up at Marcus with confusion that quickly cleared into recognition. He babbled something that sounded like a question, reaching up to touch Marcus's face with tiny fingers that explored like a blind person, confirming identity through touch. Yes, Marcus said softly. I'm your papa. Diego responded with a smile that transformed his entire face, then immediately grew serious and pointed toward the hallway where Maria's room was located. Even at 18 months old, he understood that something was wrong with his world. Mama is sleeping, Marcus explained, using the simple language that children needed. The doctors are helping her feel better. Diego considered this information with the gravity of someone much older, then nestled back against Marcus's chest and said clearly, Papa, stay. It was not a question, but a statement of need so direct that Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotions he had no experience processing. Yes, he managed. Papa, stay. Rosa had awakened and was watching the interaction with an expression Marcus could not read. He has never said that before, she said quietly. Papa, stay. Usually he just cries when men leave, because they always do. The words were an indictment of every man who had entered Diego's limited world and then disappeared, but also an observation about the pattern that Marcus himself had established through his absence. I'm not leaving, Marcus said, and meant it more completely than any promise he had ever made in business. Over the following hours, Marcus experienced fatherhood in concentrated doses. He learned that Diego preferred to be fed small bites while sitting on someone's lap rather than in a high chair. He discovered that his son was fascinated by elevators and could entertain himself for 20 minutes watching the floor numbers change. He found out that Diego had strong opinions about books, rejecting some stories completely while demanding others be read repeatedly. Most importantly, he learned that being needed by someone was completely different from being useful to them. In business, Marcus's value came from what he could produce or provide. With Diego, his worth was measured simply by his presence, his willingness to hold and comfort and stay when staying was what was needed. When the doctors finally allowed them to see Maria, Marcus carried Diego into her room and felt his chest constrict at the sight of her. She looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines and bandages, her face pale but peaceful. Diego immediately reached toward her, saying, Mama, with urgent concern. She cannot hear you right now, the doctor explained, but many patients in her condition are aware of voices and familiar presences. Talking to her, letting her know she is not alone, can be very helpful in the healing process. Marcus found himself speaking to Maria, while Diego babbled in her direction, telling her about everything that had happened since the accident, about how well Diego was doing, about how many people were taking care of him. He told her about the lawyers he was hiring, the pressure he was putting on the hospital to provide the best possible care, the way Diego had slept peacefully in his arms as if he had been waiting his whole life for his father to show up. He knows who I am, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't understand how, but he recognized me immediately. Maybe you talked about me, or maybe some connections are just stronger than denial. But he called me Papa, and he meant it. Maria remained still and silent, but Marcus thought he saw her fingers move slightly when Diego reached for her hand. They established a routine over the following days. Marcus took leave from work, the first time he had taken more than a long weekend in 10 years, and stayed in Baltimore. He rented a suite at a nearby hotel but spent most of his time at the hospital or at Rosa's apartment, learning to change diapers and prepare bottles and read the same board book 17 times in a row because Diego found it endlessly fascinating. Catherine called repeatedly, asking when he would return to New York and why he was being so secretive about his business in Baltimore. Marcus deflected her questions with vague references to family emergency that were technically true, but completely inadequate to describe the transformation he was experiencing. Diego thrived under his father's attention, becoming more animated and confident each day. He learned to say up when he wanted to be held, book when he wanted stories, and mama with increasing urgency whenever they visited the hospital. But he also learned to settle into Marcus's arms for naps, to share his snacks without being asked, and to look for his father first when he needed comfort. The legal battle with the drunk driver's family began immediately, with Marcus's attorneys facing off against theirs in a conflict that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with money and influence. But Marcus had more of both, and his motivation was pure, in a way that business fights had never been. He was not trying to win for profit or pride. He was fighting for the woman who had raised his son alone and the future that Diego deserved. More importantly, he was fighting to become the kind of man who deserved to be called Papa by someone who meant it completely. On the fourth night, while Diego slept in a hotel room and Rosa stayed at Maria's bedside, Marcus sat in the hospital chapel and tried to make sense of the man he was becoming. 4 days ago, he had been Marcus Whitfield, billionaire entrepreneur, master of his universe. Today, he was a father who had learned to sing Spanish lullabies phonetically because they were the only songs that helped his son sleep. The change should have felt like loss of freedom, control, the simple life he had built around his own priorities. Instead, it felt like finding something he had not realized he was missing. Diego needed him in ways that had nothing to do with money or power, loved him not for what he could provide but for who he chose to be in moments when no one was watching except the child who saw everything. Marcus pulled out his phone and called Catherine in London. It was morning there, and she answered cheerfully from her hotel room overlooking Hyde Park. "Finally," she said. "I was beginning to think you had disappeared completely. When are you coming home?" "I need to tell you something," Marcus said, and then explained about Diego, about Maria, about the accident and the revelation that had changed everything he thought he knew about himself. Catherine was quiet for a long time after he finished. Finally, she said, "I see. And what exactly are you planning to do about this situation?" "Be his father," Marcus said simply. "And what about us? Our life, our plans, our marriage?" Marcus looked toward the hospital room, where his unconscious son's mother fought to return to the child who needed her. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can't go back to pretending Diego doesn't exist. I won't do that to him, and I won't do it to myself anymore." Catherine's response was measured, controlled, the voice of someone calculating advantages and disadvantages. "We'll need to discuss the implications when you return. This changes many things." "Yes," Marcus agreed. "It changes everything." After ending the call, Marcus returned to Diego's room and stood watching his son sleep in the portable crib the hotel had provided. Tomorrow, Maria might wake up. Tomorrow, he might have to explain to her why he was there, what he had learnt about himself, what kind of father he wanted to become for the child they shared. But tonight, Diego slept peacefully while his father stood guard, and Marcus Whitfield discovered that some responsibilities were not burdens to be managed, but gifts to be treasured, not problems to be solved, but relationships to be lived one moment at a time, until they became the foundation of everything that truly mattered. Maria's eyes opened on a Thursday morning while Marcus was reading Diego a story about farm animals, their son perched on the edge of her hospital bed, chattering away as if his mother could hear every word. Marcus saw her consciousness return gradually, awareness flooding back like sunrise over a landscape that had been dark for 8 days.
"Diego?" she whispered, her voice barely audible through the oxygen mask.
Their son immediately scrambled toward her face, babbling excitedly in a mixture of English and Spanish baby talk that needed no translation. Diego had been telling his unconscious mother about everything he had experienced with his father. The hotel room with the big bathtub, the elevator that went up so many floors, the way Papa read stories with different voices for all the characters.
"He's been talking to you every day,"
Marcus said softly, moving closer but giving Maria space to focus on their son.
"The doctors said you might be able to hear us."
Maria's eyes found Marcus over Diego's head, and he saw confusion flicker across her face before memory returned. The accident, the hospital, the impossible sight of her son's father holding him with the tenderness she had dreamed about but never expected to witness. "You stayed," she said, "and it was not quite a question. I told you I would." "You told me many things over the past year and a half," Maria replied, though her voice held no anger, only exhaustion and wonder. "Most of them were about why you could not be here." Diego had settled against his mother's shoulder, as close as the medical equipment would allow, making the soft humming sounds he used when he was content. Marcus watched them reunite and felt a complex mixture of joy for their connection and unexpected jealousy that he was still on the outside of their bond. "How long?" Maria asked. 8 days, you had us scared. Us? Maria's eyebrows rose slightly. Diego and me, Rosa and her girls, the doctors, the nurses who fell in love with him during visiting hours. He has a lot of people who care about him. Maria studied Marcus's face, taking in details that had changed during his week of intensive fatherhood. His hair was less perfectly styled, his clothes more casual, and his eyes held something that had not been there during their previous encounters. A softness that came from someone who had learned to put another person's needs before his own. You look different, she observed. I feel different. Fatherhood apparently agrees with me, even when I have no idea what I'm doing. What about your work? Your life in New York? Marcus had dreaded this question, not because he did not know the answer, but because the answer represented such a complete upheaval of everything he had built. I took leave from the company. Catherine and I are getting divorced. I'm selling the penthouse and looking for something closer to here. Maria's eyes widened. Marcus, you don't have to rearrange your entire life because of 1 week with Diego. Children are wonderful, but they are also a daily responsibility for 18 years, not a temporary vacation from your regular life. I know that, Marcus said, though he was still learning what daily responsibility actually meant. I want to be his father, Maria, not just financially or biologically, but actually present for his life. I want to teach him to ride a bike and help with homework and embarrass him in front of his friends when he's a teenager. And you think you can learn to do those things? I think I can learn to try. And I think trying badly is better than not trying at all. Maria was quiet for a long moment, watching Diego play with the buttons on her hospital gown while humming to himself. He has been different this week, she said finally. More settled, more confident. Rosa said he stopped crying every time a man left the room. He's been teaching me things too. How to be present without trying to fix everything. How to find joy in small moments. How to love someone without conditions or expectations. Those are not easy lessons for a man like you. No, Marcus agreed, but they're the most important ones I've ever learned. A nurse entered to check Maria's vital signs, interrupting their conversation but giving Marcus time to process the weight of what he had committed to. Choosing to be Diego's father meant choosing a completely different life than the one he had built around his own ambitions. It meant accepting that his most important achievements would be measured not in profit margins but in birthday parties and soccer games and the quality of the man his son became.
The police want to talk to you about the accident, Marcus said after the nurse left.
And there are lawyers involved, both yours and the other driver's family. But you don't need to worry about any of that right now. I cannot afford lawyers, Marcus, you know this. You have the best legal team money can buy. I hired them the day after the accident. Maria's expression grew troubled. I cannot pay you back for something like that. You're not paying me back. You're the mother of my child, and someone hurt you while you were trying to provide for our son. This isn't charity, Maria. This is family taking care of family. The word family hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them had fully processed. They were not married, had never even dated in any conventional sense. But they shared a child who connected them permanently whether they chose to acknowledge it or not. What does that mean exactly? Maria asked. Family taking care of family? Marcus had been thinking about this question for 8 days, and he still did not have a complete answer. I think it means we figure out how to be parents together, even though we're not together. It means Diego gets to know both sides of his heritage, your strength and love and culture, and whatever positive things I can contribute to his life. It means he never has to choose between us, or wonder why one of his parents disappeared. And it means you change everything about your life to accommodate a child you denied for 18 months? It means I finally grow up enough to admit that denying him was the worst mistake I've ever made. And yes, it means changing everything, because everything I built was hollow without him in it. Diego had fallen asleep against his mother's chest, exhausted by the emotional intensity of her awakening. Maria stroked his hair with gentle fingers, her touch careful around the IV line in her hand. He looks like you, she said softly. More every day.
But his temperament, his joy in simple things, that is not from your side of the family. Doe.
Thank God for that. Marcus said with feeling, my family's specialty is creating driven, successful, emotionally unavailable men.
Diego deserves better than that legacy. What will you tell people? Your business partners, your social circle? They will want to know why the billionaire suddenly has a Hispanic son from the housemaid. The question touched on Marcus's deepest fears about social acceptance and professional consequences. His world was small, exclusive, and judgmental about relationships that crossed class and cultural lines. Many of his associates would view his acknowledgement of Diego as scandalous, evidence of poor judgment that might affect their confidence in his business decisions. "I'll tell them the truth," Marcus said, surprising himself with his certainty. "That I have a son I'm proud of, with a woman I should have treated better from the beginning. And when Diego is older and asks why you were not there for his first year and a half, I'll tell him I was a coward who had to learn how to be brave. And I'll hope he forgives me for taking so long to find my courage." Maria studied his face for a long moment, searching for something she seemed to find. "You are serious about this, about changing your entire life for a child you barely know." "I'm serious about changing my life to become someone worthy of being his father. The child I barely know is already the most important person in my world. The learning curve is steep, but the motivation is permanent." Over the following weeks, as Maria recovered and returned to Rosa's apartment, Marcus navigated the complex process of integrating himself into their daily routine. He found an apartment in Baltimore, close enough to be available, but not so close as to be intrusive. He learned to coordinate his schedule around Diego's naps, meals, and the kind of spontaneous needs that could not be scheduled into calendar blocks. The business consequences of his choice were exactly as severe as he had expected. Several major investors pulled out of deals when word spread about his personal complications. Social invitations dried up as Manhattan society decided that Marcus Whitfield's judgment had become unreliable. Catherine's divorce attorney painted him as a man who had abandoned his responsibilities to his wife in favor of an inappropriate relationship with an employee. But none of these losses felt as significant as the gains. Diego learned to say "papa" with increasing frequency and meaning. Marcus discovered that pushing his son on a swing could generate more genuine happiness than closing multi-million-dollar deals. He found that reading bedtime stories and singing lullabies satisfied something in his soul that no amount of professional recognition had ever touched. The relationship with Maria evolved slowly, carefully, built on shared dedication to Diego rather than romantic attraction. They were learning to be co-parents, to coordinate decisions about their son's care and development, to navigate the delicate balance between Marcus's desire to provide and Maria's determination to maintain her independence. "I don't want Diego to grow up thinking money solves everything," Maria said one evening, as they watched their son play with blocks on her living room floor. "But I also don't want him to grow up thinking that struggling financially is noble or necessary." "What do you want him to learn about money?" Marcus asked. "That it is a tool, not a goal. That having enough is important, but having too much can make you forget what really matters. That generosity is more valuable than wealth, and that work should serve life, not consume it." Marcus nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her words and the challenge they presented to his own relationship with money and success. "I want him to understand that being privileged means having responsibility to help others. That his advantages should make him more generous, not more entitled." They were sitting on opposite sides of the small living room, but Marcus felt closer to Maria than he had ever felt to anyone. Not because of romantic connection, though he was beginning to understand why he had been drawn to her that night 18 months ago. The closeness came from sharing the most important project of their lives, raising Diego to become the kind of man they could both be proud of. Diego himself seemed oblivious to the complexity of his family situation. At 20 months old, he simply accepted that he had a mama who lived with Aunt Rosa, and cousins who played with him every day, and a papa who came to visit frequently and took him on special adventures. His world was full of people who loved him, and the logistics of how that love was arranged seemed far less important to him than the consistency of its presence. Marcus's relationship with Rosa's daughters, Elena and Sophia, developed into something he had not expected. 7 and 9 years old, they appointed themselves Diego's protectors and Marcus's teachers, showing him how to play games Diego enjoyed and correcting his pronunciation of Spanish words with patient authority. "Tío Marcus," Elena said one afternoon, using the title for uncle that she had assigned to him without consultation. "You need to learn more Spanish so Diego can talk to you when he's bigger."
"Why is that important?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about her reasoning. "Because Mama tells us stories in Spanish that don't sound right in English."
"And when we're mad or sad or really happy, Spanish words feel better than English ones. Diego should be able to use both languages with both his parents." The wisdom of a 7-year-old, Marcus realized, often surpassed that of adults who complicated simple truths with unnecessary analysis. Diego was growing up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable with his mother's lullabies and his father's business stories, and that dual heritage was a gift rather than a source of confusion. 6 months after Maria's accident, Marcus stood in the living room of his new Baltimore apartment, Watching Diego take tentative steps between the coffee table and the couch while Maria cheered from her seat on the floor. Their son was walking more confidently each day, exploring his world with the fearlessness that came from knowing that someone would always be there to catch him if he fell. He's going to be running soon, Maria observed. Are you ready for that level of chaos?
I'm ready for whatever comes next.
Marcus said, and meant it more completely than any business projection he had ever made. Diego spotted a toy truck across the room and decided to walk the entire distance to reach it, his steps wobbly but determined. Marcus and Maria both held their breath, ready to intervene if needed, but allowing him the independence he was claiming. He gets that stubbornness from you, Maria said, as Diego successfully navigated the journey and picked up his prize. And the joy in small victories from you, Marcus replied. He's the best of both of us. Diego looked up at his parents and smiled, then walked back towards them with his truck clutched in his small fist. When he reached the couch where they were sitting, he climbed onto Marcus's lap and offered to share his toy, babbling an explanation of its various features in his own mixture of languages. He's perfect, Marcus said, accepting the truck and examining it with the serious attention that Diego's gifts deserved.
Yes, Maria agreed, watching her son curl up against his father's chest with complete contentment. He is.
Outside the apartment windows, Baltimore hummed with the life of a city where Marcus was learning to belong. Not as a visiting executive, but as a father, neighbor, and community member.
Diego would grow up knowing both worlds, the privilege and opportunity that his father's success could provide, and the warmth and authenticity of the family that his mother had created through love and determination. Marcus Whitfield had lost a penthouse and gained a home. He had lost a marriage built on convenience and found a family built on commitment. He had lost the simple certainty of a life measured only by personal achievement, and found the complex joy of a life measured by the growth and happiness of someone infinitely more important than himself. The eyes that had once frightened him with their innocence and need now looked at him with trust and love, seeing not the billionaire or the businessman but simply Papa, the man who read bedtime stories and pushed swings and promised to be there for every important moment that was still to come. And in those eyes, Marcus finally saw the reflection of the man he had always been capable of becoming. If he had just found the courage to love someone more than he feared being vulnerable, Diego had given him that courage, and Maria had given him the chance to use it. Together, they had transformed not just his life, but his understanding of what life could be when built around what truly mattered. The baby whose eyes had forced him to face reality had become the child whose love had taught him to embrace it, and Marcus knew that every choice he made from that moment forward would be measured not by profit or power, but by whether it made him worthy of being called Papa by someone who meant it with his whole heart.